This is Dan Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And today I would like to go look at stewardship. There are a couple of grants that have come up that you should look at if you're involved with stewards. And we should say something about grantsmanship, because we've talked about preserving natural and cultural landscape features, but we haven't said much about getting income for them. It's very natural for people to get ideas or have the opportunity to preserve a natural area or a building, and it's often a discussion in the basement with 2 or 3 people, and there's always the difficulty of where is the money going to come from to do this. And that also pertains to park districts and forest preserves that do have the capacity to fund these sorts of programs, but not instantaneously. They have to do bookwork, they have to go to meetings, get approval, they have to figure out whether there are other funding sources that they can get access to. So having a body politic usually in the background is very helpful. It is also helpful if you have some sort of strategic action plan. That's not always the case. If you've got a bulldozer around the corner and a big wrecking ball, you might believe that it's time to do something quickly, and you don't have a strategic action plan. So then you have to talk to people, and talking is very, very important, because it brings out some of the difficulties that are likely to pertain. Sometimes you have to talk for years. Sometimes it's more than some people want to hear about. So that's a difficulty, but it is very helpful to have someone like the Nature Conservancy to back you up. That means they're not going to just drop and do what you want to do easily. You have to have photographs, and quickly you have to put together some sort of plan. And usually it's understood by groups like the Nature Conservancy. They're well aware of what you're talking about often, and you don't have to inform them very much. The Nature Conservancy is probably the biggest one that we have at the national and international level. It started out with George Fell as a student of 3 ecologists, Vestal, Shelford, and Kendi, who were early ecologists who had sort of a union. And George Fell was one of their students. He went off to Washington, bought a house and a offset press, and created chapters statewide, countrywide, and now worldwide. If you have a site that you think is worth preserving, then the Nature Conservancy will have experts to come and have a look at the site. They may already have your site on file. It may be that you're giving the TNC the information they need to go forward on their own. But it may be that the corridor, like the Kickapoo Trail, can be assigned to established forest preserves or conservation districts. So you need to be able to work out those mechanisms. Then some of this sort of funding comes down to the local level or the state level. At the national level, the National Science Foundation is a typical example of where the Congress decides that they want to push a certain issue, and they put money behind that push, and then you create a manual, and you as an applicant for that money will mean that you have to go by the guidelines that are there. If you are uncertain, TNC and others will be able to put you together with an expert and figure out what you have to do. The Rails to Trails movement has been doing a lot of this sort of thing, where they keep on hand engineers, surveyors, and historians and others who can give you help. At the state level, we have three major contributors: the Victoria Foundation, the Clean Air Foundation, and the Lumpkin Foundation fund most of our natural history acquisition. They have their guidelines, their experts, and the people that they would like to support. Sometimes you have to be aware that these are private foundations that want to do what they want to do, so you can't necessarily say, excuse me, but I would like you to do this. That may be a possibility, but it may also not be something that funding agency would want to do. The federal and state agencies are more likely to have very big manuals because they're handling state and federal funds. So there's public money here to be spent, and there's probably a little bit more concentration on making sure that you're meeting guidelines. There are also some deadlines, and deadlines are appropriate because if you're going to have a look at 200 applications, people are going to have to be able to read those. So they're going to have to be farmed out to people who are the readers. Usually the readers are experts in the field of that particular grant paradigm or individual parts of it. At the local level, we have trusts. One of the more interesting ones is the in the Sangamon River area. It's a land conservation foundation, and it concerns itself mainly with getting land on the riparian corridor, which is the Sangamon River, and do a few other things, but this is their main thrust. And they will do educational work associated with something that there's an overall understanding of nature, nurture. They will work with places like Allerton Park and other local agencies that allow them to do clean water, or like Prairie Rivers and the like. So we do have local agencies. at the really local level, you have one of our proposals that's coming up is for art, outdoor art, and it's supported by the Champagne Forest Preserve, the Urbana Park District, the Champagne Park District, Spurlock Museum, and 40 North, which is an art organization. And they're asking for a request for proposals for $1,000 for you to do something public on lands that belong to the Park Districts and Forest Preserves and Spurlock Museum. And there are a bunch of guidelines that go with that. I'm not quite sure when the deadline is, but I think it's in the middle of July, or it's fairly close. Some of these dates have been affected by the virus. But there are guidelines as to what you can do and what you can submit. And you have to decide whether $1,000 is going to be enough for you to put together a sculpted piece or a venue where you're going to educate young children or meet the details locally. So that's a relatively small grant. I took down for the environmental natural history one, I took down the amounts that have been instituted for the stewardship programs, which started in about 2014, with $3 million. Then in 16 it went down to $500,000, and it stayed at 17. It was $600,000, and then for 20 it's $260,000. So it's a small bundle. You need to look at it. You need to go to past histories to see who got what. If you have a strong opinion as to what you want to do, then you don't necessarily have to bend your out of shape to get the grant. You just have to say, no, I can't do that. This program will be for several different categories. There will be a community stewardship. That means it's going to help other agencies that have already got stewards going and help them do something about what they want to do. It may not help you to buy a plot of ground. It might not more likely be working with people who have already been expending their energy. It's going to be managed by people who have a 501c3. The 501c3 is a tax exemption which says that the government at the federal level appreciates what you're doing, and they will allow you to take the contributors to your cause will take a tax exemption. So you just can't be anyone that backs up for support. It may be that some of this money could go to existing agencies like forest preserves or park districts, and then they can have your group work with them, but they will be the supervisors. They will be the ones with the 501c3. It probably will start if you are accepted as an agency to accept some money to work with stewardship, the stewardship program will start in about November and continue for about 18 months. So that's a stewardship program. We're looking perhaps at the master naturalists on Monday at 1 o'clock. Several of us will be meeting to see how we can work with master naturalists who have as part of their program to meet requirements for working with stewardship. So can the local situation meet up with the state situation, and how can you do it? So then there's K through 12 children in schools where they have been encouraged to have pollinator plots, and so that's something that can be funded, and sometimes the funding is given matching materials. So in this case, if you join the program and you have $7,000 in matching money, then the Clean Energy Foundation will put in an extra $7,000. So that's called matching grants, and they can count. It also counts that you have quid pro quo. That means that you are doing something that's valuable, or you're contributing something that's valuable. So if you put in a steel fence to stop off-road vehicles from going onto your preservation, then that amount of money can be made to match. It might be that your time, if it's recorded, if you have someone who's done 360 hours of volunteer time, and it's worth X amount of money per hour, then in certain grants that can become matching money. So it's very, very helpful to have people who are CEOs, coordinators, who know enough about the rules of the game to be able to bring these things together. Then there's a public conservation thing, and it also includes events. So it might be that if you're going to run a prairie conference, then you might get support for that. And then there's the acquisition of pollinated ground. How many acres of lawn may you have taken out of lawn grass into nature? The university has been doing that. So then you have to document the amount of acreage that you have turned into nature. So there are the 4 different categories: community stewardship, schools, pollinators, and conversion of lawn into nature. That probably also includes roadsides, where a lot of nature is mown excessively and could come back into interesting nature. It's always much more interesting to drive down a corridor that has some natural history on it than to drive down a corridor that has been mown like a billiard table and there's nothing there but a pick of green grass, which is not enough to keep a butterfly or a bird or a bee together. So you'll see along roadside signs that say natural area, no mowing, please. And that's difficult for people who get paid to mow. It's taking their job away, but it is also something that is rather interesting and gives people a chance to see what their heritage vegetation was. And there's always an argument that there's going to be a raccoon or a possum or something come out of that natural history and get killed on the road. But that seems to me not a major concern, because most animals that live in these circumstances are pretty used to avoiding cars and situations like trains where they might be injured or killed. So we'll be talking to master naturalist people about what we might be able to do, for instance, at the Pope Prairie. The Pope Prairie has value as a key to another 10 mile of wide road that if we were to work with that and upgrade our prairie, then that might be a source for stewards. So then again, you have to consider whether you're going to herbicide, spot herbicide, or dig out the plants, or cut off their fruiting bodies, or go to the horticultural florist people and ask or beg not to put that particular dried arrangement into floral arrangement. So eventually they go to the cemetery and they proliferate. It might be that you even have a prairie species that takes over, and that needs to be controlled. So you may have Canada thistle, which is a very invasive weed, or autumn olive, or cypress, or other ornamentals that escape, honeysuckle. You also have to deal with the like of ash borers, which have taken out a whole sequence of ash trees in this community. So put on your thinking cap and think what you can do. And I would love to say, do something in addition. It is to enjoy what you're doing. This is not the sort of situation where you should be doing it because you feel it's important to do. It should not be an imposition. I hate to get scouts to be picking up other people's beer cans or trash. They didn't deserve to do that. They deserve to be out there, and if necessary, whacking at a tree, but they also should be able to dance with the tree or become friends, perhaps go for a dip in the local creek or whatever. The job should be an enjoyment. Maybe you bring your ghetto blaster and have music. Maybe you want to be silent and be off by yourself. There's great variety, but you should be prepared to say, what does your body do, and what does your brain do, and how can you help? In many cases, we have a need for one-to-one lawyer or an engineer or a real estate person, someone who can work with the county records to pay taxes. So if you happen to be an accountant and you get your jollies out of doing that, then we would love to introduce you to that sort of task. If you come across and there's 50 of you and we have a do-it job, which is picking seed, then that can be exciting too, but it's not something that's going to go into the future with 20 years of commitment. So there's commitment. And we would like to say that if this is your commitment for a while, and you might want to also dip into pots and you need to go into ceramics, and then that is our joy as well as your joy. This is living, and even in virus time and in problem of having slaves in the background, you need to be able to shift and move, and sometimes it will lack leadership, and that can be a problem too. But sometimes some of our best music has come from people who don't have that leadership. They bounce off of each other and they're kind of equal. So I encourage that sort of thinking. What else can I say about one of the most interesting aspects of doing this sort of work has been to have programs that come to you and ask, can you support something? So there was a program at the federal level called the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. And that was designed to give young people a job in the summertime. And we did that. We had, I think at one stage we might have had 20 different people working on it. But one of the things we decided to do was a mural in the North End, which was a Black History mural. And so we had teams, and we also had to have an art leader. So we had one of the Wilger families, Rivers families. Wilger Rivers was, she's been since then a professor of art, but at that time she was unemployed and was able to work with us to create a Black History mural, which dealt with Champaign and Urbana, but it also went down to places like Broadlands, where there were early Black families. And it said things about coming from the South, and it was a 30-foot mural on a building on Park Street, and it did a lot of educating. A lot of people were rather pleased to see this mural that lasted something like 33 years. By that time, the wall had been prepared for a mural, but it was getting to be chipped. And also the person who owned the building wanted to take the building down and put in a new building. So it was appropriate to look at that mural at that time, and it was would cost $50,000 to seal a wall, a similar wall somewhere else, and it was not cost effective. it was very interesting because across the way from that mural there was two buildings that were used by black community people who could not be on campus in residences. So this was like the Sunshine Law, where if you were black, you were expected to be out of town by sunset. And so the people that owned those two houses were impressed, and they liked this mural. And I'm still getting people who came back just this week. I got Sheila Wiley, is now 90, and her daughters are wanting to get a birthday card from people who were working with that mural. The assistant artists had their name there, so people knew whether it was Brit or whoever that was doing this. The artists were painting by number, more or less, and the early morning crew found it very hard to get up. The evening crew, you couldn't stop them from keeping on painting. So this was a community event which brought character to that little spot. And some people went past and said, the whites of the eyes are too white and the blacks are too black. So there was criticisms. So you have to handle that sort of criticism. And it's fun to do, and it's interesting. It might be a little embarrassing sometimes, but you have to know what you can do. And we really respect people who have to get up and go to be working with people and bringing them together on a project that they wouldn't necessarily do by themselves. In the future, another mural might go up. I'm looking at some concrete walls on the 2nd Street detention pond, and I'm thinking they could be painted with vegetation, native vegetation. It might take a while to do, and it would take some artists, and it would take some scaffolding, and it would take some questions from people who would rather see the wall bare bones. So how could you do that? How could you meet the idea? Can you go to a city meeting and present the idea, or do you talk to an alderman or sometimes a professional who is in charge of that territory? How do you press your case? We're watching because we've been lucky enough to have a 25-mile Kickapoo Trail. It started out with an idea, and we moved it and shaped it, that idea, and no one was prepared to do it, so we took out an agreement with the retiring railroad and the Federal Surface Transportation Board, and we argued about whether you should have a trail authority and create a new authority where you had enough board members, perhaps 7 or 9, that you could include some of the royal opposition. It was a big debate. The local people sometimes wanted to go with an established forest preserve that was 75 years old, but you had to realize that at some stage that forest preserve had to be put together by someone who had an idea, and then a group had an idea, then the state had an idea, and then so in the case of the Kickapoo Trail, that's eventually Uh, different people got together. It was not enough funds was available for first. It's taken 20 years to get underway. Its first 7 miles is used a lot. It's very wide and doesn't leave a lot of native vegetation or some of the history that goes back to Nature Conservancy and George Felt. But it's creating interest. At this end, you have to decide where is the end of the trail. How do you get into Urbana? How do you get into Champaign? How do you get across town? These are all questions that require some people to get together. It may be 3 people. Often that's how things have gotten done, is you get 3 people that are in cahoots, and they go to the state or federal level, and bingo. If the politics is right, then you may get a facility that you would otherwise not have. Probably more interesting and somewhat more cumbersome is to get people together so you enlist some of the arguments that you might suspect to be around. Where do you put the porta potties? Where do you put the kickapoo? The tables, or the chairs, or the parking? Do you plant trees on ground that is prairie? So there are lots of questions that we have here that come out gradually, even if you have people who get the idea rolling and the ideas happen later. It's sometimes better for them to happen before. And often people who are quite opposed to certain aspects of preservation of a building, for instance, it may take them 15 years to change. All of a sudden something clicks. Like the Pepsin factory, we had a historic factory that dealt with the economics of how do you have a small industry in a town like Monticello. So somebody discovers Pepsin. We still use it as Pepto-Bismol. It helped people to digest their food more effectively, and it contributed to alleviation of constipation and diarrhea. So it went from the square and basement apple cider press in the basement, squeezing Pepsin out of Senegal leaves. It went to a Pyatt family house, and then a factory was built around the house that some was 5 stories high, some was 3 stories high, but it was a batch process, and it went around the world. There was a railroad, what we call the siding and loading area. So you started at the top with the ingredients. So you had Pepsin, but you add a little bit of alcohol to make it more interesting, and you add some sugar, and you came down, and gradually you mixed things, and so you have a factory with 200, almost 300 people, and you put in a gymnasium, and you have facilities for Monticello people, but people who would come in from away around Monticello. So how can you justify, when this process goes through its life, you at first to get the person who was doing the squeezing, the Dr. Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell had birthed most everyone in Monticello at that time, and probably except for midwives, and but he was popular, but he didn't want to be. he didn't want to be the entrepreneur that would take this successful product further. So then there were a group of entrepreneurs named Hott and others that have their names still in Monticello, and they operated very efficiently, and they had a street named State Street, which has huge buildings on it that were part of the mansions that went with the factory. And the horse stable is big enough for a family to live in. And it's still there. So the stories are still there. And these are the sorts of things that tourists love to come to and ask you, what is your history here? Did you have anyone that was murdered in town? Oh my, yes, often that happened. And Monticello has one of those situations. So the jail becomes interesting. So do you keep the jail? You move around the jail and move on. So eventually the Pepsin factory came down, and I hated to see it come down. But it's still there, and the lawn is there where this 5-story building was. And I'm hoping that as the administration of Monticello gets to be larger, that they might put up something that was a facsimile of this economic process that allowed people to come together and to be excited. I can remember time and time again people coming by and saying, I used to polish the handrails up to the office, or someone would have climbed the elevator, the water tower, or they'd had this ability to work with the computers that were Honeywell computers. There was history there, and I imagine a little museum, perhaps, with a administrative offices, something that's substantial enough so that it's not a lumber factory remodel, which is what Monticello City has as offices at the moment, and some of them extend into what was a chicken factory. So I would like to see the square that is intact to say something to tourists. The Railroad Museum has been wonderful. It had some opposition when it first came in, but it, again, they took the railroad station off of one railroad line and put it on the 7 miles that the Railroad Museum bought, and there's an interurban nearby that the city has bought. So gradually you put these things together, but you need people to do that. You need people to go to the city meetings and listen and present the idea. If you want to save a wooden elevator, you have to be there 10 years before it gets burned down. And you have to be not too sorry about losing certain things. This is a game where there are many different opinions. So we're looking at 23 miles between Whiteheath and Clinton, and there's sure to be some opposition about using that 100-foot wide passageway with prairie on either side. It has now been put into corn in some places, but our trail is still there. So now that we have a kick-through trail and we have a rather wonderful Monticello trail that goes across the Sangamon River, how could we bring those things together to augment what the Railroad Museum does? Does the Railroad Museum want to come into Champaign? Perhaps not. It's 25 miles. If you put grandmother on the train with 25 miles ahead and 5 or 6 children, then you'd better have something to interest the passengers, because It takes a historic train a long time to get to Champaign. But the idea is there. We're working on it. We're re-railing 4 miles of Heartland Pathways railbed, and railroad engineers that also have a foot in the museum are gathering up steel for rails and ties, and give us 20 years, we may be able to get a historic train from Monticello into Champaign. Yes, so if you had your druthers, where would you put the depot in Champaign? Where would you stop? I'd stop over there somewhere in between State and Randolph, where there's been a derailment, and where there were 2 lines is now 1 line. And 1 line's been retired. And it could be a bicycle way that would go under Washington and across the north end to Busey Woods, or around Busey Woods, or through Busey Woods, and on, and then down to across the boneyard, and come out at the yards in Havana, which belong to Norfolk Southern, and they're big yards, but there could be an easement around the north end. So how do you go about getting an easement on the north end? It's very, very hard to do that with railroad people. You have to visit with 15 railroad lawyers. You have to figure out if you could ever pay a rental, or if you could buy a little piece of land, which is not impossible. So we're encouraging you to think about these proposals that are coming in. Things have changed a little. People are beginning to realize that they don't have much open space anymore. There was Champaign County with 95% prairie, and so help me, the state has preserved in little pieces here and there about 0.01% of the prairie that we had. And we have a beautiful little prairie at Rantoul, and we're thinking about augmenting it with the purchase of a 9-acre plot. And that's interesting. And right now it is interesting. I can hear what I think is hail falling on the building, where we're doing things that are not in the studio of WEFT, so that we don't contaminate each other. It's had a lot to do with the internet. We're talking about, we're using a cell phone to a cell phone, and then Havana Public Television is moving the sound that I'm making to the people who are remotely putting together WEF's program. And it's a little dicey. It's not the world's greatest. I'm going to stop speaking for a moment, because the sound is the sound of a studio office with a window at the back. So now you have to think about bigger issues. If you're out there picking seed, that's not too hard to do, especially if you got someone to indicate what the seed is. But if you're dealing with climate, you're dealing with the sound that I'm listening to right now. It's going to change. It's going to change dramatically. And not everyone believes that that's going to happen. But the Arctic is melting at a very rapid rate, and that water has to go somewhere. And a lot of our cities around the world are going to be flooded. So are you thinking about those sort of things? It starts at home. It starts right there where you're going to be a steward of invasive species. Elizabeth Kirby is very big on taking out invasive species. And she does a lot of this. And she's been, it doesn't need to be rewarded, but she needs to do it in a sensible fashion, and she does so. So there needs to be a relationship between, do you take out this invasive creature with an herbicide, or do you take it out physically? The fact of the matter is that you have 3,000 acres of quasi-prairie, then it's going to be too much to even think about taking out and condition something else as a physical thing. You can't do that. So how do we tolerate herbicide, and how do we work with the company that owns the glyphosate at the present time, the Bayer organization from Germany? How do you think about that? Just an individual program? Do you just go to the teasel and take off the heads? Where do we burn the seed? The cemetery next door brought this creature, so they also allow us to burn the seed. But that takes just a little bit of negotiating. We have to work with the people who used to dump. So just this week I've been talking to contractors with the possibility of taking a backhoe or a bulldozer, just tidy up some very ugly parts of our 9-acre prairie. If you step carefully into that prairie at the moment, it has purple cone on the borrow pit, or the place where gravel was taken out. You're like regrowth succession. You're doing something that was there 10,000 years ago when you had a raw glacial moraine. Now you're trying to speed that up by having nearby plants in refugia. So this is not exactly like 10,000 years ago when the plant that comes in has to come in from New England, Aster comes in from New England. Something else comes in from the west. Refugia in southwest corner of Wisconsin, where massive meltways, waters, canyons. What is your understanding of this? How do you teach? Can this transect of going from wet upper moraine to dry on top with loose, how does it connect with a corridor that goes east-west across the county? So we have to be game to think perhaps we can buy 9 acres on a Kickstarter. So that means some of you who know what we've been doing for years and years will say, yes, give it a go. And the young people are saying, yes, we don't have much left. Let's do this. And let's connect with the Pumpkinvine line that goes through, or used to go through, Rantoul to Dillsburg, and on to Gifford, and a mile of remnant prairie on the railroad when it was discombobulated. And there are other sites east and west. If you go along that continental glaciation, you come across the creeks that allow the water to run out. You come to a landfill, and just There's a zillion things that you can think about. I'm going to stop because I think I want to leave room for WEF to say something about the wonderful things that they do, including we like to think that this program gets to some people, and they seem to respond that way. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.